Okay, as I adjust my camera, this is the third installment. Almost got it ready here. There we go. Of the video lectures on learning, and this is the last slide that you saw for the second part that you just watched. So, what I want to do is start with classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is probably the most technical and the most difficult part of learning to understand. I would highly recommend reading your textbook and kind of following along, especially with classical conditioning, because it gets kind of technical. You guys are smart; you'll figure it out. But let's start with a definition, and I'll give you some examples. Classical conditioning is a specific type of learning where one learns to associate or link two or more things or stimuli, and then anticipate events. I refer to this as learning by association. There is somewhat of an instinctive component or process involved, and you'll definitely want to have this definition. Like I said, I'm going to give you examples, and we're going to break down classical conditioning in several different ways. Now, the first thing we need to do before we go on is we need to understand the four components of classical conditioning. We have what's called the unconditioned stimulus. Then we have what's called the unconditioned response. As you're writing these down, I would leave space to write down definitions and to provide examples, and we're going to do that as we go. So again, you have the unconditioned stimulus, you have the unconditioned response, you have the conditioned stimulus, then the conditioned response. So what does all this mean? Well, let's start talking about that. Now, conditioned here simply means learned or acquired. Unconditioned means unlearned, or something that just naturally exists. So again, conditioned means it's learned or it has to be acquired somehow. Unconditioned means it's something you don't have to learn. It's just kind of built in, or instinctive, if you will. Okay? Okay, next, a stimulus. We've already seen the word stimulus a couple times in these videos. Is anything in the environment, physical environment, that can bring about some kind of a response. Okay? Heat, or temperature rather, can be a stimulus. If I turn the heat up in our classroom to, let's say, 120 degrees, and you're going to feel that 120 degree temperature in your classroom, that's a stimulus, because it's going to evoke a response. A response is just that. It's just a reaction to a stimulus. Your reaction to that heat is going to be to sweat, or to have a headache, or to become irritable. Okay? If I turn the lights off and I walked around the room in the pitch dark and just randomly stabbed you guys in the arm with a needle, which I'm not going to do, by the way, I promise, the stimulus would be the needle, because that's something that's going to bring about a response. Your response to that is going to be to scream, to kick me, to yell, I don't know. It's going to be your reaction to that stimulus. Just about anything you can think of could be a stimulus. Pain, pressure, temperature, appearance, whatever. And our responses or reactions to the stimulus or stimuli will vary greatly. So have this in your notes. Understand what these are, because now we're going to go back to the previous slide here, and we're going to start to try to understand what this really means. So, an unconditioned stimulus is an unlearned stimulus. It's something in the environment, so right here, this first one. An unconditioned stimulus is something in the environment that just naturally exists. Okay? And I'm going to explain all this as we go. An unconditioned response is simply an unlearned response to that unconditioned stimulus. Okay? So I would jot that down. Let me say it again. And then we'll start to give you lots of examples to make it clear. An unconditioned stimulus is an unlearned stimulus. It's just something that naturally exists that will naturally bring about an unconditioned response, or an unlearned response. Okay? So let's just think about those two for a second. Just for a second. So we're going to cover up the bottom two in your minds. Just look at the top. Look at the top two. An unconditioned stimulus for, let's just say, a dog, because a lot of us have pets, and we're going to talk about dogs more here in just a second. An unlearned or unconditioned stimulus would be food. It's naturally out there, and it's naturally going to elicit a response. The unconditioned response for the dog when it sees food is to drool, or to salivate, or to maybe do some kind of a happy dance. Okay? If you've had pets, you've seen that. That's an unlearned, just naturally occurring stimulus response pattern. Now, here's where the learning part truly comes in, or the learning by association comes in. We're going to teach the dog, don't write this down yet, we're going to teach the dog to associate the unconditioned stimulus with a conditioned stimulus. Condition means learned, so a conditioned stimulus is a learned stimulus. If I can get the dog to associate food with something else like a tuning fork or a bell or something like that, then I can eventually get the dog to learn a new response. A conditioned response is a learned response. The dog, sooner than later, if he associates the food with the bell, will start to salivate just to the bell, even without the presence of food. So that gives you kind of an idea of where we're heading. So let me give, again, well, I'll keep explaining this. I'm going to give you some examples of this stuff as we go too. Okay? So again, unconditioned stimulus, unlearned stimulus. Unconditioned response is the unlearned response. The conditioned stimulus is the learned or the new stimulus, and the conditioned response is the learned or the new response. I know I'm being redundant, but I just want to make sure that we have that. So let me skip, we already saw that. So let me get to the classic example here. Hopefully you can see this. Your book talks about a Russian physiologist by the name of Ivan Pavlov. Okay? Now Pavlov was studying dog saliva. He was not a psychologist, he was a physiologist. And he started to notice something. When you work with animals or when you work with dogs, you have to take care of them, right? You have to feed them. So obviously he would feed them and take care of them. And he noticed that very naturally, again, if you remember, the unconditioned stimulus was the food for the dog. Anytime he put the food in front of the dog's unconditioned or unlearned response was to salivate. Just happens. You notice that. Okay? Now, he started to notice something. He started to notice that the dog would salivate to something other than the food. Now, if you got a brand new puppy and you just rang a bell, okay, a tuning fork or a bell, you know, we'll just say a tuning fork. It makes a noise. It's kind of like a bell, okay? He started to figure out anytime he came close to the dogs, when the dogs would hear his footsteps, they would start to salivate, even if he didn't have the food in his hand. The dog is starting to learn by association. The dog is learning to associate the food with his footsteps. So, and you might think, well, big deal. That's a lot of talk about nothing that's really a big deal. But it kind of is. He stumbled upon by accident one of the most important facets of learning. So he thought, I wonder if I would ring a bell or produce a tuning fork, you know, which makes a sound, if I could get the dog to salivate in the presence, or excuse me, without the food even being present. So that's exactly what happened. So he introduces a neutral stimulus, a fork. He would ring, you know, he would twist the tuning fork, make the noise. Over time, the dog essentially learned to salivate to that instead of the food. Now again, a dog wouldn't normally salivate to a tuning fork, because how would a dog know that means food is coming unless he's already seen the food before? So he's pairing the two together. Now, during the conditioning over here, Ivan Pavlov rings the bell, there's a pause, then he presents the food, and then the dog salivates to the food. Now, over time, the dog has learned anytime he hears the tuning fork, he immediately salivates. Not to the food, but to the tuning fork. So the conditioned stimulus now is the tuning fork, and the conditioned response is the salivation. So that's the classic example. Now let's look at another example. I'm going to use myself as an example here. For me, my wife, she's a wonderful cook, and for me, she will make spaghetti, which is absolutely wonderful. For me, the unconditioned stimulus is spaghetti. It's unlearned. It makes me salivate. So my unlearned response when I smell her spaghetti cooking, as you can see, is to salivate to the spaghetti. That's very simple, basic, unlearned stimulus response. Okay. Now, classical conditioning happens here, and write this in your notes at this point. This is really important to have written down. In order for classical conditioning to work, the unconditioned stimulus, okay, has to be associated with the conditioned stimulus. These two have to be linked up. They have to be associated, or it's not going to work. Okay? And I'll explain. For whatever reason, my wife, anytime she made spaghetti, she would place them on these really awful cream-colored plates. I think it's called Fiesta ware. I don't collect plates, but she would do that. So over time, I started figuring out, anytime I would come home and I would see these plates on the table, I would start to do what? I would start to salivate a little bit. I would get that hungry feeling, right? Even though she hadn't even started cooking the meat for the spaghetti. I had learned over time to associate the spaghetti with this specific plate. So my learned response, or the conditioned response, is to salivate not to the spaghetti, but just simply to the plate. So again, in other words, let me back up again. In this example, in order for classical conditioning to work, the dog has to associate the food, right here, with the tuning fork. If he doesn't, then classical conditioning will not work. So again, to repeat that, I can't say that enough. The unconditioned stimulus has to be linked or paired with the conditioned stimulus in order for this type of learning to work. So we have a couple of simple examples of kind of how this works. And we can actually use this type of learning to treat people with problems. We can actually use this in therapy, believe it or not. And we're going to talk about that here in just a second. Now, stimulus generalization. This is another term in your book. This occurs when a new conditioned stimulus is similar to the original conditioned stimulus, so it still brings about the same response. So let me go to my spaghetti example. We're going to go back to that same paradigm of the spaghetti and the cream-colored plates. Now, I come home from work, and the cream-colored plates aren't down on the table, but my wife has a different, like a canary yellow or a neon yellow plate. Is that close enough in appearance and shape and color to the cream-colored plates that I would still salivate to the plate, even though the spaghetti's not ready? Well, probably. And here's why. You still have the same unconditioned stimulus, the spaghetti, okay, which still makes me salivate, so the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned responses have not changed. Except now the conditioned stimulus is new. It's not the cream-colored plate. This is a yellow, neon yellow colored plate. But it's pretty close, pretty darn close in appearance to the cream-colored plate. So now the conditioned response, it's still going to hold because it's that plate is similar enough to the original conditioned stimulus. Okay? If that happens, if I salivate to this new plate, then stimulus generalization has occurred. Now, conversely, I'll come back to that. Stimulus discrimination. This happens when a new conditioned stimulus is different from the original conditioned stimulus in that it does not bring about that same conditioned response. For example, let me just say it this way. Let's say that I come home, same example to keep it simple, okay, with the spaghetti. Again, just like always, the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned responses will not change. The spaghetti always makes me salivate. That's an instinctive, natural process. Now, I come home and my wife has bricks on the table set where the plates, the cream-colored plates, normally would be. If I came home from work and saw the bricks sitting where the plates would that make me salivate? No, because the bricks in no way resemble the cream-colored plates. So this would demonstrate stimulus discrimination, because this stimulus is not close enough to the original one, which was the cream-colored plate, to bring about that conditioned response. So the salivation will not occur. So, gives you an example. And then the last slide here for part 3, extinction. This happens when the unconditioned stimulus is paired with nothing, or no longer paired with the conditioned stimulus. For example, if we go back to the example of the spaghetti and the plates, just to keep it simple, or we could talk about the dog, we could do that too, but we're going to go back to this classic example because it's in your heads already. So let's get back there. Watch me skip back. Here we go. Now, I've learned over the years, anytime I see these plates, it means spaghetti's coming, so I'm going to salivate. Now let's say the next 5 times, 10 times, 20 times that my wife cooks spaghetti, she does not serve them on the cream-colored plates. She just serves them on something completely different, like paper plates, or maybe in a bowl or something like that. Now, after the 21st time of not seeing this plate, where this was the way it was before, now all of a sudden she brings back the cream-colored plate after 20 times of not serving it on those plates. Am I going to salivate immediately? No, I'm not, because this learning has become extinct. It has died off because I have not been exposed to the pairing of the unconditioned stimulus with the conditioned stimulus. Does that make sense? And you can kind of review that and read in your book too if it's a little confusing. So we have some of the main components of classical conditioning covered here. We have the terminology down, we've talked about discrimination, we've talked about generalization, and we've also talked about extinction. And again, it can be kind of complicated to talk about or to understand, but just kind of review this if you need to. You've got it on here. You can watch it as many times as you want. You can email me if you have questions about it as well. So we'll call that the end of this part. Thanks.